Hi, welcome back to ITC314. Today we're going to look at Topic 7, virtualization security. So this is an important issue for any organisation because as we start to move our computing resources into a virtual environment, we start to get a whole stack of new challenges in security that come along for the ride. Now, security depends on each component in that virtual environment. So you really got to look at the host computer, the hypervisor, the guest operating systems, the applications you put on the VMs, and the storage that you attach to them. So what we're going to do in this topic is we're going to look at some of these security aspects of these various components and security recommendations that work around them. So as always, we've got a bit of reading to do in our topics. But this week, most of the readings come from either government or industry. The NIST one is a really good one. That's one that you'll probably want to keep because you'll probably end up going back to that a number of times because it is a good guide. So I would recommend that that's one that you would want to download and keep. The Cisco white paper is a similar one. So with security threats, we have a situation where the virtual security threats are in many cases quite similar to the threats that are faced by a physical machine. However, they have slightly different vulnerabilities. Many of the vulnerabilities are the same, but there are some different ones that don't appear in a physical machine. So, for example, suddenly we have dynamic virtual environments. And traditional security mechanisms don't play well with a dynamic environment. They're really quite well settle down quite well for static environments, but these are dynamic and shift and move, and a normal standard type of security arrangement can't necessarily handle that. We suddenly have a series of high-value targets in these valuable VMs, and it's the VM itself can be stolen or hacked or misappropriated or whatever. So the VM suddenly becomes a target because you could move it out of a data center on a USB stick, whereas it's difficult to shove a server under your arm and walk out and be unnoticed. Suddenly your workloads multiply and are mobile and start to move around all over the place. And of course, then if you combine that with the issues around multi-tenancy, if you're trying to do and provide a number of different business tenants in the same database or the same application, which some enterprises do for their different business units, then suddenly those issues around mobility start to really become quite interesting. We have some limitations around VLANs, and then when we're trying to scale data servers out and quite sometimes span them across VLANs in order to provide that high availability and redundancy, it can become some issue. And of course, the complexity of those data servers starts to become part of a problem as well. So we also need to look at hypervisors. The standard old physical box didn't have a hypervisor, so it didn't have any security issues around that. There are security issues around that. There are security issues around the guest operating systems because you may be running more than one operating system on a host. You could be running a mixture of Windows Server, Red Hat Enterprise, Linux, SUSE, etc. So there can be a number of different operating systems, and keeping them all patched can be interesting. You have issues around virtualized infrastructure, and so suddenly this starts to become much more interesting. How do you put that together, and how do you secure a virtual infrastructure? And of course, if you're providing virtual desktops, then the security issues around that are somewhat different again to the same but different to that you would find on a standard physical desktop. So there are some things that we need to look at, the way in which things change. So we have to think about how is this going to work for us. So as always, the best way to do it is to plan, and careful planning prior to installation is part of the solution to getting a nice, good, secure installation. So again, that NIST security guide gives you a life cycle model that you can use that starts with initiation, planning, design, implementation, ops and maintenance, and disposition, so that you can work through a life cycle for your virtual infrastructure in order to determine how is that going to work with your security, with your enterprise security policies. And so, what you're trying to do here is bring everything back into line, and so that planning and deployment phase is quite an important phase, and that's one of the things that we'll look at in this particular topic. And as always, there are some vendors out there who have some really interesting solutions, and Garber's reading talks about some of them, such as Checkpoint, McAfee, Semantic, iTrust, Trend, etc. So, you know, this is where you can start to do a bit of investigation for yourself, see what some of these guys are offering, whether it's worthwhile. Should we move on? Is there something new? You know, something that you can be then looked at and say, you know, I can use this in the workplace, or this is something that that may or may not be useful for me. So as always, this fits into your study patterns quite well. You meet a couple of different learning outcomes with this, evaluating the requirements for effective VM management is part of it, security is part of that. But also being able to analyse the requirements for management of a virtual infrastructure, because you're looking at the planning and the implementation there. So of course, this topic will help you doing assignment 3 to a certain degree, where you build and configure a guest VM running in VirtualBox, but also in assignment 4, where a knowledge of virtualization security and the planning thereof will be quite essential in planning that virtual infrastructure. And of course, the final exam, where you will be questioned on this knowledge. But again, this is knowledge that you'll constantly use in the workplace to manage that VM fleet. So again, if you have any questions, this is a good time to start thinking of putting them up on the forum so that everybody can discuss and talk about them, or raise questions with your lecturer, and we'll be happy to try and help you resolve your problems. See you next week.